Welcome back to this digital seminary course on the Bible. The goal of this course, of course, is to help you understand how your Bible works, how it was written, formed, transmitted, and translated until it ends up in your hands. In this particular class session, we're talking about the earliest English translations of the Bible. We Protestants think it axiomatically true today that the Bible should be translated in the language of the people. But most Christians, for most of history, didn't see the point of owning their own copies of the Bible. Bibles had a specific and defined role in Christian society. To own one was, first of all, hugely expensive. Most people were illiterate, so they couldn't read it even if they had it. And so what would you even do with one, even if you had one and could read it? I mean, I'm personally very glad that nearly anyone in the world can pick up a Bible and read it today. I think that's a positive change, but I don't think we Protestants always appreciate that there needed to be a cultural shift in order to make owning your own Bible worthwhile. You need to not live in a peasant hut where it can get dirty sitting in the mud. You need to be literate. Bibles need to be super inexpensive, which was impossible until relatively recently. You need to not work 10 hours a day in the field, so you actually have time to read it. In other words, you need some leisure time. And you need something to do with the things that you read. If nobody else in your village, in your country, or whatever, are reading the Bible, then what are you going to do with the knowledge that you're gaining? Are you going to find out that the church is doing something wrong and then lead a revolt? Reading the Bible is not just an individual affair. It is a social act. And that's the point I'm trying to get through right now. People in the early Middle Ages were very aware that without a healthy connection to society, you will die. And I think Martin Luther understood this. He wasn't this individualist revolutionary. He made sure he brought his political leaders, like Frederick the Wise, on board. The individual doesn't stick his neck out in the Middle Ages. There was a thick social web that individuals needed to survive. Now, we saw this happen in the city of Metz in 1099. Pope Innocent III wrote a letter to the Christians there saying that he knew that they had translated large parts of the Bible into French and had begun reading them in secret. And as a result, these lay people started preaching. Oh no! They started separating themselves from their old church members, and when priests came in to correct them, they told the priests that they knew the Bible better than the priests, which may have been true. Innocent said that the desire to understand the scriptures was commendable, but look what happens when people get the Bible, right? The social order is turned upside down. The priests are gods, the Pope said. I kid you not, quoting Exodus 22:28. The lay people simply shouldn't have the Bible until they have a mind to understand, and the priest alone, knows what the people can understand. The church, not one's personal study of the Bible, offers salvation. That was the view back then. So you are saved by your affiliation to the church, not by how much of the Bible you know. So why would you own a Bible? Now, there were several reasons for the popes to discourage unauthorized Bible translations. Social and religious control are some of the darker reasons, but they were often trying to avoid a return to those early church days where every church seemed to have their own translation of the Bible, and those translations generally stunk and were inconsistent with each other. They had to standardize those translations with the Vulgate, and as I briefly mentioned in the last video, the Vulgate too was quickly modified throughout the churches according to the tastes of local Christians, to the point where few people knew what Jerome's original text even said. Now, their better instincts were to avoid textual anarchy. In the early Middle Ages, it was hard enough to get priests who could read. Bible translations were certainly a problem for another century. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't want a greater knowledge of the Bible, and that doesn't mean that many priests and clergy didn't sincerely want the people to know the Bible as well. They did, and they did. When you think of the first English translations, most people think of John Wycliffe, but we know of several earlier English translations, beginning with Caedmon, an English monk who lived in the 600s. Caedmon began writing songs composed of major sections of the Bible so that worshipers could sing them as they worked and so learn Scripture. About the same time, another English monk, the Venerable Bede, who, legend says, was dictating a translation of the Gospel of John into English when he was on his deathbed. And when he had finished the last word of the Gospel, he died. All right, well, in the 800s, Alfred the Great, one of the few literate kings of his day, considered it a crowning achievement of his reign that the clergy were far more able to read the Bible at the end of his reign compared to the beginning, and he also had some of the Bible and other Christian books translated into English. In one monastery, monks wrote the English words of the text above the Latin words in their Bibles. There was someone translating the Bible into Old English in every century of the early Middle Ages, and no one in Rome seemed to care. And then the Normans invaded England, mixed French with the English language, and Middle English was born. And suddenly the Bible had to be translated all over again. And then there was a Black Death and Crusades and all of that stuff. Then John Wycliffe came. He was a popular and brilliant teacher. It wasn't Wycliffe's translation that got him into trouble per se. It was his little habit of criticizing the corruption of the church. Now, the church got him fired from his post at Oxford, so he left with some of his students who became known as Lollards. To be sure, the church objected to Wycliffe's desire to translate the entire Bible into English. No one had yet managed to translate the entire Bible, but we cannot separate the issues of Bible translation from church loyalty. Those who did any English translation work so far were all openly loyal to the church, and the church didn't seem to care about their efforts to translate. Now, the religious landscape had changed from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages when Wycliffe was roaming the earth. With the rise of the Waldenses and Albigensians, the popes of the High Middle Ages were suspicious of reform movements as Trojan horses of heresy. Awesome band name, by the way. This suspicion also cast a shadow on Wycliffe's work as a translator. Wycliffe was more than a translator, he was a movement builder, and that was what scared the people in Rome. In 1380, Wycliffe finished his New Testament. The Old Testament appeared 2 years later, no doubt accomplished by Wycliffe's colleagues. Now, this translation was really just an English translation of the Latin Vulgate, including the Apocrypha. Wycliffe's own translation work wasn't particularly good, and his colleagues had to update it and re-release it after his death. And this update became the English standard for the Bible for 200 years, despite the fact that the church fiercely opposed it. Now, the church managed to burn more than 1,000 copies of Wycliffe's Bible, which is impressive because each copy cost a small fortune and took somebody 10 months of painstaking work to copy it out. It was said that an hour, a borrowed hour with Wycliffe's Bible would cost you a load of hay. The fact that 1,000 or 2,000 copies even existed shows that the church's opposition created more demand as English Christians wondered what all this controversy was about. As a result, today we have 170 copies of Wycliffe's Bible, and that's awesome. John Huss, one of Wycliffe's followers, was condemned at the Council of Constance in 1415, and the injustice of this lit a fire 100 years later under a certain monk named Martin Luther. Now, we have to travel to the time of Luther to find the next English translation, that of William Tyndale. Now, the world had dramatically changed again in those 150 years. Now we have Henry VIII sitting upon the throne of England. He had no love for Luther or the Reformation, but neither did he appreciate that the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. So he charted a middle path between the two, and the Church of England was born, with him at its head. Now, Tyndale, like Wycliffe, had been trained at Oxford. 1523, he asked permission of the Bishop of London to translate the Bible into English, wanting to translate Erasmus's Greek text as Luther had done. Now, the bishop was said to be sympathetic to church reform, but he denied Tyndale's request, so Tyndale did it anyway, traveling to Wittenberg to meet Luther and on to Worms, where it was safer. He published his New Testament in 1526 and never quite finished his Old Testament. The Bishop of London publicly burned those copies of the Bible which he could catch. If borrowing Wycliffe's Bible for an hour cost a load of hay, the printing press had made it so you could own Tyndale's New Testament for half of that amount. Realizing the bishop couldn't burn all of Tyndale's Bibles, burning worked better when it took 10 months to copy the Bible, not when a press could churn them out day and night, the Bishop of London demanded that a London merchant buy as many copies of Tyndale's New Testament as he could, and the bishop would pay whatever it costs. Well, the London merchant was a friend of Tyndale, so he went to Tyndale and told him about it, and Tyndale said, "Cool, I could use the money to make more copies, and if the bishop wants to burn them, then all of England will rise up in revolt," which kind of happened. Now, that story is semi-legendary, but it's based on true events. Tyndale would be kidnapped and killed by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who didn't quite get Luther. The next year, Henry VIII approved the translation of the Bible into English. In 1535, An associate of Tyndale, Miles Coverdale, released his own translation, as he was more of an editor than a translator, though. He compared Tyndale's translation to Luther's, the Vulgate, and some others, and in that comparison, he wrote what he thought was the best text. And it wasn't a great translation, but the reason why I mention it is because it managed to be the first permitted English Bible. Coverdale cleverly dedicated it to Henry VIII as the greatest defender of the faith, the hugest, biggest defender of the faith, even better than the Pope. And Henry heard about that and told some aides to look into this Bible thing that Coverdale was doing. And the aides said, the translation had a ton of mistakes. Yeah, said the king, but he seems like a nice guy. He likes me after all. But is it heretical? Well, no, the aides said. Cool, said the king, then let's allow it in England. Coverdale's Bible was the first complete modern English translation of the Bible to be permitted in England. John Rogers, a translator who worked with Tyndale, finished translating the Old Testament for Team Tyndale. And John Rogers then released the Matthew Bible, so called because he published it under the name Thomas Matthew after Tyndale's death. Can't take too many chances here. The Matthew Bible came out in 1537, just 2 years after Coverdale's, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer loved it, and so did the king, partially because it had a whopping 3-page long dedication to the awesomeness of Henry VIII. Now, both Coverdale and Tyndale's Bibles separated the Apocrypha from the rest of the Old Testament, but were unwilling to get rid of it completely. That would take a lot longer. Matthew's Bible was basically Tyndale's work, but with a bunch of notes, and whatever Tyndale hadn't translated, the Matthew's Bible relied upon Coverdale. John Rogers was among the first killed when the Catholic Mary Tudor took the throne of England later on. So we have the Coverdale Bible in 1535. 2 years later, we have the Matthew Bible. And 2 years after that, in 1539, we have the Great Bible, the first authorized English version. Now, King Henry commanded every parish in England to have one of these Bibles. And to that end, some 9,000 copies were printed in its first 3 years. It's called the Great Bible because it's huge. The pages were about 9 inches by 15 inches or so. Miles Coverdale was the principal editor of the Great Bible as well, and it became very popular in part because he did his best to hide his Lutheranism. But as Henry VIII saw common people arguing about its translation choices and singing about it in pubs, he realized that allowing the common people to own a Bible was a mistake. So, just before his death, Henry outlawed all Bible translations except the Great Bible, which was simply too large and too expensive for any peasant to buy. The higher classes, of course, were still permitted to own a Bible. But if you wanted to read one at church, you'd find it chained to the wall, not to prevent you from reading it, but to prevent you from stealing it. The Great Bible was the first English Bible to follow Erasmus's order of the final books of the New Testament. Luther had Hebrews, James, Jude, Revelation because he wasn't confident about the canonicity of any of those books. But the Great Bible had 1st and 2nd Peter, and then 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and all of that in the order that we have them today. The ironic thing about the Great Bible is that during a subsequent revision of it, many of the titles above the text were rewritten under the authority of the former Bishop of London, the same one who personally had Tyndale's Bibles burned. That's the wink, wink throughout the 1530s. I mean, another bit of irony here is that these Bibles being published throughout the 1530s all relied upon Tyndale for their New Testament and at least some of their Old Testament, though no one could openly admit it. Things had begun changing at the end of Tyndale's life, but not for Tyndale. Coverdale's Bible, again, based largely on Tyndale's work, came out while Tyndale was still alive, but Tyndale was still persona non grata, so Coverdale could not give him public credit. Everyone just acted like Tyndale had nothing to do with any of this. Tyndale was just a couple of years ahead of his time, and that's the difference between being a heretic and a hero. Now, the influence of Calvinism began to be felt in England during the reign of Edward VI, who followed Henry VIII, culminating in the Geneva Bible of 1560, although it wasn't published in England until 1575. And would you believe it? The eternal Miles Coverdale had a hand in this version too. Now, the story here is that when the Catholic Mary Tudor took the throne of England, about 800 or so wealthy Protestant refugees went into exile, a quarter of them ending up in Geneva with the reformer John Calvin. Like the other English Bibles of the 1500s, the Geneva Bible was yet another revision of Tyndale's New Testament. The Geneva Bible was the first English Bible, however, where the entire Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew, not from the Vulgate. And it also took advantage of another Protestant refugee, Robert Estienne. This enterprising printer had begun adding, would you believe it, verse numbers to the New Testament, and these appeared for the first time in English in the Geneva Bible. The marginal notes of the Geneva Bible were thoroughly Calvinist, which irritated church leaders back in England, but many of the people loved the Geneva Bible. The Scottish Parliament, finally shaking off their allegiance to the Roman Church, declared that every home that could afford a Geneva Bible must purchase one. And I'm sure it helped that their countryman John Knox had a role in it as well. The Geneva Bible was also affordable. Even the poorest laborers could pick up a Geneva New Testament for less than a week's salary. And it was universally respected, even by those who disagree with Calvinism, as an exceptionally good translation. With the success of the Geneva Bible and with the Protestant Elizabeth on the throne of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury set out to accomplish a new translation, can you believe it, that would improve the quality of the Great Bible without any of that Calvinist stuff. I mean, come on, Presbyterianism, that will never catch on. It was called the Bishop's Bible, and it came out in 1568. The Bishop's Bible learned a lot from the Geneva Bible, including the use of verse numbers. The Bishop's Bible was meant to replace the Great Bible, also replacing it as England's authorized version at that time. So, now we have two popular Protestant Bibles in England, one reflecting Calvin's Reformed tradition and one reflecting the sensibilities of church leadership. And the waters were about to get muddier, because the Roman Catholics then released their Douay-Rheims version, with the New Testament appearing in 1582 and the Old Testament appearing somewhere around 1609, 1610. The Douay was a translation of the Vulgate, which the translators believed was a purer source text than even ancient Greek manuscripts. Huh? Anyways, if only John Wycliffe would have known. Wycliffe was declared a heretic, his bones dug up, burned, and the ashes thrown in the river, all for translating the Bible into English. And now the church that did this to him was releasing their own English translation. The Douay was full of so many Latinisms, like Paul urging people to do penance instead of repent. That one Protestant called it a translation that needs to be translated. All right, so now we have 3 English Bibles floating around, each from a different theological perspective. What I think is interesting about all of these versions is that translating the Bible really takes iterations, doesn't it? It's like writing software. You release it, and then you realize there are some bugs, and you could have done this or that better. So you update it and fix some sloppy code. You add more features. You make it bigger or smaller, whatever. You just keep tinkering with it until you find one that really, really works and catches on. And England was about to find an English translation that works, one that would learn from the Bishop's Bible, learn from the Geneva Bible, and learn from the Douay Bible, and we call it, everybody now, the King James!